He looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks, stumbling through the dust with nothing but the clothes on his back. But what happened when 6 women invited him inside would change everything he thought he knew about salvation and damnation. Caleb Dunn dragged his boots through the endless dirt, each step a monument to his own failure. The sun was a hammer, beating down on him for 3 days straight, and his canteen had been empty since morning. His stomach wasn't just cramping anymore. It was twisting itself into a tight, angry knot, a familiar friend that had been with him ever since that poker game back in Cedar Ridge. That wasn't a game. It was a theft. They'd taken his horse, his last few dollars, and the one thing that truly mattered, his father's silver pocket watch. All he had left was his pride, and out here in the unforgiving wasteland, pride was just another word for slow death. And then, like a ghost on the horizon, he saw it. A homestead. It shimmered in the heat waves, a large wooden house nestled between 2 barren hills, with a thin ribbon of smoke rising from its chimney. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again. He was sure it was a trick of the light, a cruel joke played by a sun-addled mind. But the house remained, solid, real. He stumbled forward, a flicker of hope so small it was almost painful. This was it. Water. Maybe a scrap of food. A moment's rest before the dust claimed him for good. As he got closer, though, the scene got strange. 6 women sat on the wide front porch. Not one, not two, 6. They were dressed in simple, clean clothing, a stark contrast to his own ragged filth. And they were watching him, not with fear, not with the suspicion he was used to from townsfolk who saw a drifter and immediately thought of trouble. They watched him with a calm, unnerving curiosity, as if they were expecting him. The eldest of them, her dark hair streaked with silver, stood up. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and her eyes seemed to see right through the dirt and desperation, straight into the wreck of his soul. "You look like you could use some water, stranger." Her voice was low and steady. Caleb's throat was a desert. He could barely force out a croak. "Yes, ma'am, I'd be grateful." She studied him for a long, silent moment. Then she glanced at the other women on the porch. No words were spoken, but a message passed between them. A silent language of nods and glances that made the hairs on Caleb's arms stand up. He didn't understand it, but he knew one thing. He was being judged. Finally, a slow smile spread across her face. "I'm Magnolia, but folks call me Maggie. These are my sisters." She gestured to the others. Cora, with severe gray hair and kind eyes. Violet, with fiery auburn hair that matched her intense gaze. Ruby, whose warm smile didn't quite reach her steel-hard eyes. Sadie, the youngest, with blonde hair and a nervous energy. And Mercy, tall and thin, with hair as white as bone. Sisters? Caleb looked from one face to the next. They shared no features, no blood. One was dark-skinned, another pale. One was tall, another short. They were a collection of strangers. Yet there was a bond there, something invisible and unbreakable that held them together, something stronger than family. "What's your name, son?" Maggie asked. "Caleb Dunn, ma'am." "Well, Caleb Dunn. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" His stomach answered for him, a loud, pathetic growl that echoed in the afternoon stillness. The younger women, Sadie and Violet, couldn't help but smile. Maggie chuckled softly. "That's what I thought. Come on up. Mercy, fetch this man some water. Cora, see about a plate." As Caleb climbed the wooden steps, his legs shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and a strange new apprehension, he saw it again. That look, that silent conversation passing between them all. Something was happening here, something far bigger than a simple act of charity. But when the cool water finally touched his cracked lips and the smell of roasting beef reached him, he pushed the questions aside. Thirst and starvation had a way of making a man ignore his instincts. He didn't know it then, but his instincts were screaming the truth. These 6 women weren't just being kind. They had been waiting for him, and his life of aimless wandering wasn't just taking a pause. It was over. The meal was a feast. Fresh bread, so soft it melted in his mouth. Tender beef that fell apart on his fork. vegetables that tasted of the rich earth they'd come from. Caleb hadn't eaten like this in years, not since before his father died. But it wasn't the food that put him on edge. It was them. The 6 women sat around the table with him, not eating, just watching. They watched him chew. They watched him swallow. Their eyes followed every move he made, like he was some strange creature they were studying for the first time. It was a quiet, intense scrutiny that made his skin crawl. "You've been traveling alone for a while," Violet stated. It wasn't a question. Her green eyes were sharp, cataloging every rip in his shirt, every line of exhaustion on his face. Caleb swallowed a piece of potato and nodded, wiping his mouth with a real cloth napkin. "Since the spring." "Lost everything?" Ruby asked. Her voice was like honey, but her question was a razor. "Card game," he mumbled, the shame of it still a fresh wound. He saw the man's face in his mind, a cruel smile, a deck of marked cards, a man named Silas. "Everything," Ruby pressed, her eyes unwavering. "Family too?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He set down his fork, his appetite vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "My pa died 2 winters back. Consumption. Ma followed him a month later. Said her heart broke and just stopped." The 6 women exchanged that look again. He was getting used to it now, that silent, secret language. But this time, he saw something new in their eyes. Not pity, it was recognition. A deep, shared understanding that sent a shiver down his spine. "No brothers? Sisters?" Sadie asked, her voice barely a whisper. She looked so young, so out of place in this harsh land. "Had a sister once, Sarah, married a preacher and moved east. Haven't heard from her in 3 years." Caleb pushed his plate away. The food suddenly felt like ash in his mouth. Why all the questions? Maggie leaned forward, her hands folded on the worn wooden table. Her gaze was hypnotic. "Because we've all been where you are now, Caleb. Lost, alone, with nowhere to go and no one to care if we lived or died." "Every one of us came to this house the same way you did," Cora added, her voice raspy but firm. "Wandering, broken, ready to give up on the world." Caleb looked around the table, from one woman to the next. He tried to imagine them as he was now. Filthy, starving, hopeless. It seemed impossible. The house was too clean, too well maintained. The pantry he'd glimpsed was stocked to the ceiling. There was money here. Real money. "Who owns this place?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. "We do," Mercy said, her voice as pale as her white hair. "All of us. Together." "But how?" Caleb pressed. "A place like this. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere." "The woman who built this house," Maggie began, her voice taking on a reverent tone, "was named Eleanor Whitmore, Mercy's grandmother. She wasn't like other people. She saw things. She saw the potential in people they couldn't even see in themselves." Maggie paused, letting the name hang in the air like a sacred text. "When she died, she left this house to us. But she also left instructions." Caleb felt a cold dread mixed with his confusion. "What kind of instructions?" "That this house would always be a refuge," Maggie continued, her eyes locking onto his. "A sanctuary for lost souls. But not just any lost souls, Caleb." Her gaze intensified, and for a second, Caleb felt like she was reading his mind, seeing every mistake he'd ever made, every secret he'd ever kept. Specific ones. The room was suddenly very quiet. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, counting down the seconds to a revelation he wasn't ready for. "She left us a list," Ruby said, her voice low and serious. "A book. It has names in it. Descriptions. It even tells us the exact time certain people are meant to arrive at our door." The blood drained from Caleb's face. He felt dizzy, like the world was tilting on its axis. You're telling me some dead woman knew I was coming?" "Your name is in her book, Caleb Dunn," Sadie whispered, her eyes wide. "It describes the circumstances that would bring you here. The poker game. The loss of your father's watch." She took a shaky breath. "It even described what you'd be wearing." Instinctively, Caleb looked down at his faded blue shirt, in his worn leather vest. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. This was impossible. This was madness. But that wasn't the strangest part. Oh no. The strangest part was what Eleanor Whitmore had written next to his name. A set of instructions these 6 women had been following for 15 long years. A prophecy they had been waiting to fulfill. And now that he was here sitting at their table, they could finally tell him the truth. The truth about who he really was, and why he'd spent his whole life feeling like a stranger in his own skin. The wooden legs of Caleb's chair scraped violently against the floor as he shot to his feet. "This is crazy," he stammered, his voice tight with a rising panic. "You're playing some kind of sick game with me. Some dead woman can't predict a man's life." "Sit down, Caleb," Maggie said, her voice calm and gentle, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. "There's no game. Let us show you." Every instinct screamed at him to run, to bolt out the door and never look back. But where would he go? Back to the dust? Back to starving? Against his better judgment, he slowly lowered himself back into the chair. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Mercy slipped out of the room and returned a moment later. She was carrying a heavy leather-bound book. The leather was cracked and ancient, the pages yellowed with the passage of time. It looked like something that belonged in a church or a museum. She placed it on the table in front of him with a soft thud. With reverent hands, she opened it to a page marked with a faded silk ribbon, and there it was. In elegant, spidery ink, he saw his own life laid bare. Caleb Dunn, born Cedar Ridge, 1841. Parents, Thomas and Mary Dunn, deceased. Sister, Sarah, married to preacher William Hayes, moved to Philadelphia. He read on, his breath catching in his throat. Lost family fortune in a game of poker, spring 1871, to a man named Silas Croft. Will arrive at the homestead on August 12, 1871, near sundown. Will be on foot, wearing a faded blue shirt and a worn leather vest, carrying nothing but pride and desperation. His hands trembled as he touched the page. Every single detail was there. Every painful, humiliating fact of his existence. He even remembered the name of the man who cheated him, a name he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. Silas Croft. How could she know that? How? He whispered, the word barely audible. How is any of this possible? Eleanor had a gift, Cora explained softly. She could see the threads that connect us all, the patterns that shape our lives. She saw that you were meant to come here, and she saw why. Why? The word was a choked plea. He needed to understand. Ruby reached across the table, her warm hand covering his shaking one. Her touch was surprisingly comforting. "Because you're here to help us finish something Eleanor started but couldn't complete before she passed." "What kind of something?" he asked, his mind reeling. Violet rose from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the vast, empty landscape. "This territory is about to change, Caleb. The railroad is coming through in 2 years. When it does, this land, this worthless, dusty land, is going to be worth a fortune." Eleanor knew this would happen, Sadie continued, picking up the story. "She used the money her late husband left her, and she bought up thousands upon thousands of acres. She bought it all under different names, secret purchases. She was building an empire in silence. But she died before she could execute the final part of her plan." Maggie turned a page in the ancient book. A beautifully drawn map was revealed, covering 2 full pages. It showed the entire territory, and it was covered in dozens of red X's, all connected by a web of thin black lines. Caleb saw it instantly. The X's weren't random. They formed a strategic perimeter, a perfect circle around a massive central plot of land. "She needed someone with a very specific set of skills to help us secure the final pieces," Maggie explained, her finger tracing the lines on the map. "Someone who understood surveying, someone who could read complex land deeds and navigate legal challenges." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. My father was a surveyor. He taught me everything he knew before he got sick." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the women. It was the final confirmation. "She knew," Mercy said, her voice filled with awe. "She saw your future, just like she saw all of ours. We've been here for years, managing these properties, keeping everything ready for this exact moment. But we couldn't move forward. Not without you. Move forward to what? Caleb asked, his gaze fixed on the intricate map. Ruby smiled, a flash of white teeth in the dimming light. To becoming the wealthiest landowners in 3 territories, Caleb. Eleanor's plan will make us rich beyond imagining. Rich enough to build more houses like this one. Rich enough to help hundreds, maybe thousands, of lost souls just like us. He looked around the table at these women, these 6 strangers who had been waiting for him, some of them for their entire adult lives. They were offering him a destiny he never knew he had. And if I say no, he asked, testing the boundaries of this unbelievable reality. Then you walk away, Maggie said simply, without a hint of resentment. We'll give you a horse, supplies, some money for the road. You can go on drifting. No hard feelings. But if you stay, Cora added, her kind eyes pleading with him, if you help us fulfill Eleanor's vision, you'll never have to be alone again. This will be your home. We will be your family. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 6 times. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. He had a choice to make, a choice between the lonely freedom he knew and a future that felt like a dream. But as he looked down at the book, at the page with his name on it, a cold feeling washed over him. He saw more writing at the bottom of the page, a section they had conveniently skipped over, and he saw the look in their eyes again, that shared, secret glance. But this time, it wasn't recognition or pity, it was fear. What aren't you telling me? He asked, his voice low and demanding. There's more written on that page. I can see it from here. The women froze. The gentle, welcoming atmosphere in the room evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Maggie let out a long, slow sigh. It was the sound of a secret that had been kept for too long. With a trembling hand, she turned the book so he could read the final lines. Caleb leaned forward. The words seemed to jump off the page, burning themselves into his mind. Upon Caleb's arrival, Thomas Garrett will discover Eleanor's deception. He will learn of the secret land purchases within 7 days. He will come with men and with weapons. The sisters must be prepared to defend what is rightfully theirs. Caleb's knowledge of the law and the land will be their only salvation, but only if he chooses to stay. Caleb looked up from the book, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The name echoed in the silent room. Who, he asked, his voice tight, is Thomas Garrett? Violet's face was grim, her green eyes dark with old hatred. He's Eleanor's stepson, she said, and he's the man who is going to try and kill us all. Eleanor's stepson, Violet repeated, her voice laced with venom. He inherited Robert Whitmore's original estate, the main ranch, but he never knew about the other purchases. Eleanor was too smart for that. She used her own inheritance, money Robert had left to her personally, to buy up the surrounding territory in secret. As far as Thomas Garrett knows, Ruby chimed in, his stepmother died a poor, grieving widow. He thinks he owns this valley. But if he finds out the truth, Cora finished, her hands clenched into tight fists on the table, if he finds out that we, a group of lost women, control the land that will soon hold the railroad tracks, he won't just try to claim it, he will bury us in it. Caleb's mind was spinning. This wasn't just about fulfilling a dead woman's business plan. This was about walking into a war. He's already been sniffing around, Sadie said, her voice trembling as she began to pace nervously around the room, asking questions in town, wondering who's been paying the taxes on all these abandoned parcels of land for the last 15 years. Eleanor knew this day would come, Maggie said, her gaze steady and hard as stone. The book warned us. Thomas is a dangerous man, Caleb, Sadie continued, her pacing growing more frantic. He's not just a rancher. He has connections, rough men, claim jumpers, hired guns who would kill a man for a bottle of whiskey and a gold coin. If he discovers what Eleanor truly built here, he'll take it by force, Caleb finished for her, the grim reality of his situation crashing down on him. And you've been sitting here all this time, waiting for me to show up and help you fight him? He shook his head in disbelief. I'm one man. I don't even own a gun. We have guns, Mercy said, her voice a quiet, chilling whisper from the corner of the room. Eleanor made sure of that. Plenty of them. But guns alone won't win this fight, Maggie interjected, her expression grave. Thomas is clever. He knows how to work the system. He's got the local sheriff in his pocket, a judge who owes him favors. He'll try to crush us with the law before he ever fires a shot. This was Eleanor's true genius. She hadn't just predicted a gunfight. She had predicted a legal battle. Cora reached under the table and pulled out a heavy, steel-reinforced wooden box. She clicked it open, revealing dozens of meticulously organized documents. Land deeds, purchase agreements, bank records, all tied neatly with ribbons. Eleanor documented everything, Cora said, a note of pride in her voice. Every transaction is legal and binding. But the paperwork, it's complex, full of legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. We need someone who can unravel it, someone who understands surveying laws, property rights, inheritance statutes. Someone like your father, Maggie said, her eyes boring into him. Someone like you. Caleb reached out and picked up one of the deeds. The language was dense, but it was familiar. His father had spent countless nights teaching him how to read these very documents, how to spot the loopholes and traps hidden within the dense text. He could see it immediately. The document was ironclad. Eleanor had been a master strategist. "How long do I have?" he asked, his voice low. "The book says he'll find out within 7 days of my arrival." "Today is day 1, Violet said, glancing anxiously toward the darkening window. As if summoned by her words, a sound cut through the evening stillness. The distant, unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Everyone in the room froze. The air crackled with sudden, sharp fear. Ruby moved silently to the window, pulling back the curtain just a fraction of an inch. She peered into the twilight. "3 riders," she whispered, her voice tight. "Coming fast." Maggie's face hardened, her gentle demeanor gone, replaced by that of a seasoned general. "It's starting," she said, sooner than she predicted. Caleb's heart hammered against his chest. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. "Who would be riding out here at sunset?" "Men who don't want to be seen," Sadie answered, her face pale with dread. The riders didn't come all the way to the house. They stopped just outside the main property line, their forms dark silhouettes against the dying light. They were close enough to be a clear threat, but far enough away to maintain a thin veil of deniability. One of them raised a spyglass and studied the house for a long, unnerving minute. It felt like an eternity. Then as one, the 3 riders turned their horses and galloped away, disappearing back into the growing darkness. "Scouts!" Mercy breathed, her voice shaking slightly. "Thomas is making his move." Caleb realized his own hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white. An hour ago, his biggest problem was an empty stomach. Now he was trapped in the crosshairs of a conflict that had been simmering for 20 years, a conflict that was about to boil over into violence. He looked back at the book, at Eleanor's elegant script. Something was nagging at him, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. "Why?" he asked the room at large. "Why go through all this? The secrets, the waiting, this complicated plan. If Eleanor had legitimate heirs, why not just leave the land to them?" "Because legitimate heirs would have sold this land to the highest bidder the second the railroad announced its plans," Maggie explained, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "They would have taken the money and run. Eleanor didn't want to build a fortune. She wanted to build a future, a place where people like us, people the world had thrown away, could be safe. But we only get that future if we can survive the week," Ruby added grimly. Outside, total darkness had finally fallen. The valley was a pit of ink. Caleb looked at the faces around him. These women had fed him. They had offered him a home, a purpose, a family. Now they were asking him to risk his life for it. He stared down at Eleanor's book again, at the precise, chilling predictions that had led him to this very moment. And then he saw it. There was one more line, a single devastating sentence at the very bottom of the page, written in slightly smaller script, almost like an afterthought. A line the women hadn't wanted him to see. Before anyone could stop him, he reached out, his finger tracing the words that would change everything. The women tensed, but no one moved to stop him. They knew it was time. He read the final line aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper that barely carried in the silent room. Thomas Garrett killed my husband for this land 20 years ago. The proof is buried with him. Justice delayed is not justice denied. The room fell dead silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to boom like a drum, counting down the seconds of a life built on a lie. Caleb looked up, his eyes meeting Maggie's. He saw the terrible, unspoken truth reflected in her weary gaze. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about murder. And the war hadn't just started. It had been raging for 2 decades. Eleanor's husband was murdered, Caleb stated, the words feeling alien and heavy in his mouth. Maggie nodded slowly, her face a mask of sorrow and grim determination. We always suspected. Eleanor suspected. But we could never prove it. Robert Whitmore died in what the county called a hunting accident, Cora explained, her voice thick with disgust. He was found shot, in the back. His horse had supposedly been spooked and bolted. Thomas claimed he heard the shot from a mile away, Violet added, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Said he rode over to help, but arrived too late. The grieving stepson. The whole town bought his story. But Eleanor never did. Robert had been wary of Thomas for months before he died, Cora continued, the story tumbling out now that the secret was finally free. They'd had terrible arguments about the inheritance. Robert was a good man. He intended to leave the bulk of his estate to Eleanor, his wife, not his lazy, greedy stepson. Thomas was furious. Violet rose and lit a lamp, pushing back the encroaching darkness. The soft glow cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel like a conspirator's den. Eleanor spent years trying to find evidence, she said, her voice low. She hired investigators, wrote letters, begged the sheriff to reopen the case. But Thomas was careful. He had alibis. He had friends who swore he was miles away when Robert died. Eventually, the world moved on and told her to do the same. But she never did, Caleb breathed, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with sickening clarity. This whole thing, the secret land purchases, the book, the waiting for me, it was never just about money. It was about justice, Ruby said, her voice a low growl. It was about building a trap for the man who stole her husband's life and making sure he could never profit from his crime. Sadie moved back to the window, a sentinel guarding against the night. Eleanor used Robert's money, the very inheritance Thomas was willing to kill for, to buy up all the land surrounding his ranch. When the railroad comes, Thomas will discover that the fortune he's been waiting for belongs to us. Caleb walked over to the map, looking at it with new eyes. He now understood the brutal genius of Eleanor's strategy. It wasn't just a business plan, it was a weapon. The properties you own, he said, tracing the perimeter with his finger, they don't just surround his land, they strangle it. Like a noose, Mercy whispered from the shadows, a grim satisfaction in her voice. When the railroad needs to lay its tracks, they'll have to cross our land to get to his. We can name any price we want, or we can simply refuse to sell, leaving his property a worthless island in the middle of our ocean. That's why he can't let us keep it, Maggie explained, the stakes becoming terrifyingly clear. It's not just about the value of our land, it's about the future of his. If we control access, he's ruined, utterly and completely. Caleb felt the immense weight of it all settling on his shoulders. 20 years of planning, 6 women's lives, a murderer's fortune. It all came down to him, a drifter who hadn't owned more than $1 just that morning. And the proof? He asked, his mind latching on to the last, chilling line in the book. The proof is buried with him. What does that mean? Buried where? We think she meant it's in Robert's grave, Cora admitted, her voice hesitant. We've been afraid to look, afraid of what we might find, and what Thomas would do if he caught us desecrating a grave. If we dig up concrete evidence of murder, Violet pointed out, Thomas won't send scouts next time. He'll come himself, with enough men to burn this house to the ground and make sure there are no witnesses left. A new sound shattered the tense silence. Not horses this time. The sharp, distinct crack of a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. It came from the woods just beyond the porch. Everyone froze, ears strained, listening to the suffocating darkness. It came again, closer this time. the soft crunch of leaves. Someone was out there, stalking through the trees, trying to be quiet, but failing. Ruby moved with the speed of a cat, blowing out the lamp in a single puff. The room was plunged into absolute blackness. Caleb could hear the frantic, shallow breathing of the women around him. "They're testing us," Ruby whispered, her voice a disembodied hiss in the dark. "Seeing how we react, seeing if we're armed, seeing if we're scared." Caleb's heart was a drum against his ribs. He thought of what Eleanor had written. "Thomas Garrett killed my husband. A man who has killed once has no reason not to kill again." The sound came from a new direction, the back of the house. Soft, scraping footsteps on the wooden porch. A long, agonizing pause. Then the slow, deliberate turning of the back doorknob. "Decision time, Caleb Dunn," Maggie whispered, her voice right beside his ear, steady and unwavering. "Are you with us? Because once that door opens, there is no going back. Not for any of us." He looked into the darkness, at the invisible shapes of these 6 women who had taken him in. They were offering him a purpose, a family, a home. But the price of admission was a fight to the death against a man who had been getting away with murder for 2 decades. The back door creaked open, a sliver of pale moonlight slicing into the room. A silhouette stood in the doorway. Caleb realized his choice had already been made. Not by a prophecy in a book, not by destiny. It was made by something far simpler. For the first time in his life, he had found something, someone, worth fighting for. But the man stepping through their back door was about to test just how far he was willing to go, and how much blood he was willing to spill to protect them. The figure that stumbled through the doorway wasn't the monster they'd been expecting. He wasn't Thomas Garrett. He wasn't some hardened killer from Kansas City. He was a boy, barely out of his teens, with wide, terrified eyes and hands that trembled so badly he could barely hold the old rifle he was pointing at them. Don't move," he stammered, his voice cracking, betraying his fear. "Mr. Garrett, he wants to talk to whoever's in charge." Maggie moved slowly into the sliver of moonlight, making sure her hands were visible and empty. "I'm in charge here. What does Thomas want with us?" "He knows," the boy said, his eyes darting nervously toward Caleb. "He knows about the stranger. He knows you've been waiting for someone." He swallowed hard. "He wants to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Caleb asked, taking a step forward. The boy flinched, the rifle barrel wavering in his direction. Caleb ignored it. "He'll pay you," the boy said, his voice a rushed whisper. $1,000, in gold, for you to leave, tonight. Just right away, stranger, and never ever come back." Ruby let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. $1,000? He must be more scared than we thought if his opening offer is that high. The boy's hands shook even more violently. "That's not all. He said if you don't take the money, he'll make sure none of you live long enough to see the railroad arrive." It was an ultimatum. Exile or death. "What's your name, son?" Caleb asked, his voice deliberately gentle, trying to cut through the boy's terror. "Be Billy. Billy Morrison." "How long have you been working for a man like Thomas Garrett, Billy?" "Since my pa died last winter," Billy mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Mr. Garrett, he said he'd look after us, me and my sister, gave me work." His eyes darted around the dark room. "But I don't like this. I don't like threatening women." Violet stepped forward, her movements slow and non-threatening. "Billy, do you know what really happened to Robert Whitmore 20 years ago?" Billy looked up, confused. "The hunting accident? Everyone knows that story." "It wasn't an accident," Cora said, her voice firm and clear in the darkness. "Thomas Garrett murdered him in cold blood." The boy's face went white in the moonlight. That's not true. He wouldn't." "Then why is he so desperate to get us off this land?" Sadie asked, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "Why would he send a frightened boy with a rifle to do his talking instead of coming himself?" "Because he's a coward," Mercy stated flatly. "He always has been. He kills from the shadows, pays others to do his dirty work, and then plays the part of the respectable citizen." Billy lowered the rifle, just an inch. I've heard stories, in town. Folks whisper about Mr. Garrett, about Accidents that always seem to happen to people who cross him. I always thought they were just tall tales. Caleb saw his opening. He took another slow step forward. Billy, that man is using you. He's making you an accessory to his threats. When this is all over, do you really think he's going to let you walk away, knowing what you know? Knowing you were here tonight? The rifle dropped another inch. The boy's resolve was crumbling. I just need the work, he whispered, his voice breaking. I got a sister. She's sick. Needs medicine I can't afford. How old is your sister? Maggie asked softly. 12. The women exchanged one of their silent glances in the dark. It was a language Caleb was beginning to understand. This one spoke of compassion. Maggie nodded to Ruby. Ruby vanished into another room, returning a moment later with a small, heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. There's enough money in here to buy medicine for your sister for a year, Ruby said, holding it out. Food, a warm bed, whatever she needs. It's yours. Billy stared at the pouch as if it were a venomous snake. Why? Why would you help me? Because that's what we do here, Violet said simply. It's what Eleanor taught us to do. We help the people who need it. But right now, Billy, we need your help too. The boy looked from the pouch of money to the faces of the women, his own face a portrait of confusion and conflict. What kind of help? Caleb stepped right up to him, close enough to see the sweat on his brow. You're going to tell us his plan, Billy. Everything. How many men does he have with him? Where are they? And when is he planning to attack? Billy hesitated, his loyalty to the man who gave him work warring with the raw fear and dawning realization in his eyes. He looked at the rifle in his hands, then at the life-saving money Ruby was offering. He's got 6 men with him, Billy finally whispered, the words spilling out in a rush. Real hard cases. Gunfighters he brought in from Kansas City. They're camped in the Southern Canyon, about 2 miles from here. When do they move? Maggie pressed, her voice urgent. Tomorrow night, Billy choked out. During the new moon. He wants it to look like a robbery, a drifter passing through, a homestead full of women, an easy target. He took a shuddering breath, the final terrible words catching in his throat. He said to make sure there were no survivors. The words hung in the oppressive silence, a death sentence delivered by a boy who was in over his head. Sadie, still at the window, let out a small gasp. 6 professional killers against the 7 of us. We are not defenseless, Cora reminded her, her voice a rock in the storm. Eleanor prepared for this day. Prepared how? Caleb asked, a sliver of hope cutting through his dread. Ruby allowed herself a small, grim smile. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just gifted with foresight, Caleb. She was a brilliant military strategist. She turned her attention to Billy. Billy, how much do you know about the old abandoned mine shaft on the north side of Thomas's property? The boy frowned. The old silver mine? It's been flooded for years. Everyone knows it's too dangerous to go near. Not abandoned, Mercy corrected, a strange light in her eyes. Hidden. Eleanor spent 5 years and a small fortune turning that mine into a fortress, Ruby explained, the genius of the dead woman's plan finally revealing itself. It's stocked with rifles, ammunition, food, water, everything we need. It has reinforced doors and secret escape routes. If we can get inside before Thomas and his men attack, we can hold off an army. But to get there, we'd have to cross Garrett's land in the dead of night, Violet pointed out. He'll have lookouts posted. Not if he thinks the threat is already gone, Caleb said, an idea forming in his mind, audacious and dangerous. He turned to Billy. You're going to help us, Billy. I am. You're going to go back to Thomas Garrett's camp right now, and you're going to tell him we took the deal. You're going to tell him you saw me pack my things and ride out of this valley for good. The plan was simple. Deception. Buy them the time they needed to get to the mine. What if he doesn't believe me? Billy stammered. He'll believe you, Maggie said with unshakable confidence, because you're going to give him proof. She walked to a large cedar trunk in the corner of the room and lifted the heavy lid. From inside, she pulled out an old dusty coat and a wide-brimmed hat. These belong to Eleanor's husband, Robert, she said, handing them to Caleb. Put them on. Ride out the front way. Make sure Garrett's scouts on the ridge get a good, long look at you leaving. But how do I get back to you? Caleb asked. Ruby's grim smile returned. There's a reason Eleanor chose this specific location, Caleb. She didn't leave anything to chance. That mine doesn't just go down, it goes for miles underground. She mapped a network of natural caves that connects the mine to a hidden entrance less than a quarter mile from this very house. You can ride out, lead them off, and then circle back through the tunnels while we make our way to the fortress on foot under the cover of darkness. Caleb felt a profound chill run down his spine. The sheer depth of Eleanor's planning was staggering. It was like she was a ghost, still moving the pieces on the board long after her death. She knew all of this would happen, Sadie said, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and awe. She even wrote about Billy showing up at our door tonight. Billy's mouth fell open. She wrote about me? But how could she know my name? The same way she knew all of ours, Maggie said, her hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Some people are just meant to be part of the story. As Caleb put on Robert Whitmore's coat, the fabric felt heavy with the weight of the past. It smelled of dust and time and a 20-year-old murder. He knew that the next 24 hours would decide everything. Either Eleanor's grand, intricate plan for justice would finally succeed, or Thomas Garrett would at last silence every witness to his original crime, burying the truth, and all of them, in the cold, dark ground of the valley he believed was his. The deception was a masterpiece of silent theater. Caleb, cloaked in the ghost of Robert Whitmore, mounted a horse and rode slowly out of the valley. He kept to the open ground, a lone figure moving under the moonlight, making sure Thomas Garrett's scouts on the high ridges got a clear view. He was the drifter, bought and paid for, leaving town as promised. The threat neutralized, or so they would think. Once he was out of sight, he spurred the horse into a gallop, circling wide around the valley before finding the hidden cave entrance Ruby had described. It was little more than a fissure in a rock face, concealed by overgrown brush. Dismounting, he sent the horse running free with a slap on the rump. It would find water eventually, and slipped into the darkness of the earth. By midnight, the plan had worked to perfection. All 7 of them, Caleb, the 6 women, and a terrified but resolute Billy Morrison, were safely ensconced deep inside the old mine. It wasn't a mine, it was a fortress. Mercy hadn't been exaggerating. Eleanor had transformed the abandoned shafts into a subterranean stronghold. Crates of rifles and ammunition were stacked against the walls. Barrels of clean water and preserved food were lined up in neat rows. There were lanterns, medical supplies, even blankets and cots. And something else. Something far more powerful than guns or food. In a heavy, waterproofed metal box, Eleanor had stored the true arsenal. Witness statements she had gathered in secret 20 years ago. Financial records that tracked Thomas Garrett's suspicious spending after Robert's death. And the crown jewel, a signed, notarized confession letter from one of Garrett's accomplices, a man named Jack Davies, who had apparently developed a guilty conscience just weeks before his own accidental death in a bar fight. She thought of absolutely everything, Caleb marveled, reading the damning letter by the flickering lamplight. Not everything, Maggie said, her voice a grim echo in the cavernous space. She couldn't predict exactly how a cornered animal like Thomas Garrett would react when he realized he'd been tricked. They didn't have to wait long to find out. Just before the first hint of dawn, the sound began. The rhythmic thunder of dozens of hoofbeats echoing down into their sanctuary. Thomas had discovered the ruse, and he was not happy. Caleb, peering through a cleverly disguised peephole near the mine's entrance, felt his blood run cold. Billy had said 6 men. Caleb counted at least 12, maybe more, spreading out to surround the mine. These weren't just hired guns. They were a small army. A voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the canyon, boomed across the rocks. It was a voice full of arrogance and rage. "Whoever's in there!" It was Thomas Garrett himself. "You are surrounded. Come out now and we can discuss this like civilized people." Violet, who was loading a rifle nearby, let out a harsh laugh. "Civilized people don't murder their stepfathers for an inheritance." A long, tense silence followed her shout. When Garrett spoke again, all pretense of civility was gone. His voice was a low, menacing snarl. Eleanor always was too clever for her own good, but cleverness won't stop bullets. I'm giving you one chance. Send out the women and the drifter can take his chances with me. I don't think so, Caleb shouted back, his voice surprisingly steady. And I think the United States Marshal might have something to say about you threatening unarmed citizens. It was a bluff, a desperate last-ditch attempt to sow a seed of doubt. But Garrett just laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. What, Marshal? The one in my pocket? He won't lift a finger. Now come out, or we're coming in. One of Garrett's men approached the entrance, carrying a bundle of dynamite. This was it, the end of the line. Eleanor's plan had failed, but then Maggie stepped forward, a strange, serene smile on her face. The one Eleanor contacted 20 years ago, she said, her voice calm, and she walked out of the mine. She emerged into the gray morning light, holding the metal box of evidence in her hands. Garrett stared at her, momentarily confused. What is this, old woman? Some final pathetic plea? No, Thomas, Maggie said, her voice ringing out across the canyon. It's the end of your story. And that's when they appeared. Cresting the ridge behind Garrett's men were more riders, not hired guns. These men wore the badges of United States Marshals. At their lead was a grim-faced man with a silver star on his chest, and beside him were the territorial judge and a court recorder. And riding with them, pale but determined, was Billy Morrison's 12-year-old sister, pointing a trembling finger directly at Thomas Garrett. Garrett's face went white. He looked from the marshals to Maggie, his mind struggling to comprehend the trap that had just snapped shut around him. This is impossible, he sputtered. She's been dead for 15 years. But her evidence lives on, the lead marshal said, dismounting and taking the heavy box from Maggie's hands. 20 years ago, Eleanor Whitmore sent my predecessor copies of every document in this box. She also left a letter with very specific instructions. He fixed Garrett with an icy stare. It was to be opened only if two conditions were met. First, the arrival of a man matching Caleb Dunn's description at her homestead. And second, a sworn affidavit from a third party, delivered by a child, confirming that you, Thomas Garrett, had brought a private army to lay siege to that property. Billy Morrison had done more than just warn them. While they had fled to the mine, he had ridden all night in the opposite direction, to the federal courthouse 50 miles away. His little sister riding behind him. He had delivered his testimony, fulfilling the final condition of Eleanor's 20-year-old prophecy. Billy's a liar, a thief, Garrett screamed, his composure finally shattering. No court will believe the word of a boy. They won't have to, the judge said, holding up Jack Davies' signed confession, which the marshal had handed him. But they will be very interested to hear testimony about you threatening this boy's sick sister to coerce him into being your accomplice. The fight drained out of Thomas Garrett like air from a punctured lung. His hired guns, realizing they were no longer facing a few women in a mine, but the full force of the federal government, began dropping their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. As the marshals led a stunned and shackled Thomas Garrett away, Caleb stood at the entrance of the mine, the rising sun warming his face. He looked at the 6 women, his family, who stood beside him, their faces weary but triumphant. What happens now? He asked. Ruby smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that transformed her entire face. Now we go home. We build the life Eleanor envisioned for us. We help the other lost souls find their way. And when the railroad comes through? Sadie asked, her eyes shining. Maggie wrapped an arm around her shoulder. We become the wealthiest, most charitable family in 3 territories, just like Eleanor predicted. Billy and his sister approached them hesitantly. What about us? Cora knelt down and pulled the little girl into a warm hug. You're part of this family now, she said firmly, if you want to be. The sun was fully up now, flooding the valley with golden light. Caleb realized that Eleanor Whitmore had done more than just predict the future. She had meticulously, brilliantly, and patiently built it. She had taken 7 broken lost souls and woven their threads together, creating not just a fortune, but a fortress of hope. Justice, delayed for 20 long years, had not been denied. Standing there with his newfound family, Watching the last remnant of the valley's darkness disappear in chains, Caleb finally understood. He had spent his whole life wandering, thinking he was lost, but he wasn't. He was just taking the long way home. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out. And if you have a story about a time when you saw justice served after a long wait, share it in the comments below. We read every single one. Your support means the world to us. Click the video on your screen right now for another incredible tale from the untamed American West, where destiny, courage, and a little bit of prophecy collide in ways you'll never see coming.